All right, Bible nerds, welcome to another Wednesday session in this Isaiah intensive. We are booking right along. We're going to do our best to try to cover chapters 15 through 17 tonight. So remember, just briefly, chapters 1 through 12. Let me get myself a marker there, right? Chapters 1 through 12 have set us up for an understanding of how the rest of this is kind of going to go, with some themes that have been embedded that are going to be greatly expanded on into the deeper reaches of the scroll. And part of what we are focusing on with respect to that is God's dealing first and foremost in those chapters, his treatment of Judah and Jerusalem. That is given to us very clearly in the opening verse of chapter 1 by Isaiah. Then when we start chapter 13, and this will extend all the way through 23, what we are getting is a different set of visions. And they deal mainly with the nations that surround the kingdom of Judah. And that's part of the reason why I try to pop a map up there, just to give us a visual orientation of what particular kingdom we might be talking about. And again, some of these will have more expansive treatments than others. Last week in the two chapters we focused on, I only chopped it down to two chapters because both of those dealt almost exclusively with Babylon. But toward the end of chapter 14, we had just a brief treatment of Assyria and Philistia. And then in chapter 17, we're going to kind of reach the midpoint of this, with 6 nations having been addressed at that point. And then 6 other nations that will have been addressed on the opposite side of that, which will take us to the end of 23. So what I want you to pay attention to tonight, and I'll show this to you on our very first slide that we'll see here, is one theme that's going to come up a little bit more prevalently in these chapters. And that is the promise of what Messiah and the age of Messiah will ultimately bring. So I've chosen these two chapters, but of course, if we've paid attention along the way, this is not the only places, or I should say these are not the only places where we have messianic promises. We could easily reference chapters 7 and 9, but just for the sake of not overcrowding the slide, I just wanted to leave it here at this, especially considering that these two brief volumes of verses are pretty much treating the same thing, albeit from slightly different perspectives. And so we remember from chapter 2 and the first couple of verses that Isaiah is broadcasting for us that this is going to occur in this eschatological forecast of the last days, which of course is a rather nebulous term that we clearly see in the New Testament as being an almost indefinite and indeterminate period of time, since we have lived in them since the days of Pentecost. But all that to simply say that Jerusalem is going to become the Lord's cosmic mountain once more, and all other hills, all other mountains where Israel and the nations have prostituted themselves on under every green tree, every garden shrine, every idol that you could name, and all the profanity and the things that have been done there. Jerusalem is going to become the renewed center, almost like the very thing that the makers of Babylon, when forging that Tower City complex and what they wanted to accomplish through that, will actually come to fruition in the last days, but it will do so because of the fact the Lord is claiming this space as his, as it has been now for some time, since the days of David and Solomon, in dedicating Jerusalem as the religious and political capital of the people of Israel. And then finishing out verses 2 through 3, we have the clear understanding this expands way beyond the ethnic boundaries of Israel. It's not just Abraham's descendants. It's all nations rivering up to the mountain for people to come to say with one single focus of mind and heart, and that is to come to the mountain of the Lord, because he's going to teach us his ways and we will walk in his paths. It's the ideal of what God wanted to establish in Eden, right? But now it's actually the fulfillment of that goal, with all the nations being involved in that, all the sons and daughters of Adam partaking. Then we go over to chapter 4, and we have on that day, in the last days, it's all the same, that the branch of the Lord, we don't quite understand this yet, which means it probably was a later messianic revelation that is now being piecemealed back into the beginning of Isaiah's oracles and stylized in the way that it is, because Isaiah later on in chapter 11 is going to tell us who the branch is and what the branch's focus or purpose is, that it's this shoot that comes from the stump of Jesse, right? It's a new David who's going to bring the Spirit. And when he does, he will, like David, rule with righteousness and justice. But it's so much more than that in the fact that he's walking in the spirit of the wisdom of the Spirit of the Lord and various other things. But anyway, we have this very early mention of the branch and that he will be beautiful and glorious, and he will make the mountain of the Lord beautiful and glorious, and he will branch out and fill the land with fruit, and that fruit will be people. It will be the pride of Israel, the survivors, the remnant that will come from all of the conflagration that Isaiah has already been speaking about and will continue to enumerate on, including in these chapters here where we are in 13 up through 23, focusing on these nations around Judah. And then to finish out this very short chapter of chapter 4, that we get this renewal of a picture of the Exodus when Israel's out of Egypt and God is guiding them as soon as they leave the Red Sea, going to Sinai, and then from Sinai onward with pillar of cloud and smoke, telling us that the idea is that the branch is going to be the forerunner of the new and final Exodus, and that because the nations are going to come and converge on God's cosmic mountain, Jerusalem, that now this pillar of cloud and smoke is going to cover the entire summit of that mountain, and that this is going to be the rallying point of where the Exodus itself is going to culminate, right? So these messianic promises are promising that not only will ethnic Israel, but the nations are going to benefit from the arrival of Messiah and the advent of this messianic age. What's up, fellas? It's good to see y'all. So now I push those apart a little bit and wedge in between them a little bit of what we got last week. I'm sorry, I just realized now that the verse reference up at the top is not correct. But nonetheless, this comes from chapter 14. I should have changed that. I'll do that after the fact. But anyway, from chapter 14, we have, finishing that chapter, the oracle that the prophet gives when he says, "To Philistia, I will kill your root with hunger, your remnant will be slain, so wail you gates, cry out city, tremble with fear all Philistia." In a very succinct way, we have doom being pronounced with seemingly no one surviving. But we've recognized already from Isaiah's rhetorical use of phrases that those kind of all-encompassing words, in most cases, don't really mean an all-encompassing thing. It's just to signify that terror is meant to be understood as what the Lord is inflicting upon the people and the target of his judgment. And ultimately, he wants them to be afraid, but to understand that on the other side of this judgment, God intends for redemption to happen. Now, when we were walking through Babylon's oracle, through all of 13 and most of 14, we really didn't have any hint or clue that Babylon would be thrown a lifeline, that God would in some way work to try to redeem them and include them in his people. That's not to say we might not see that somewhere else, because Babylon will be treated in other places in the Isaiah scroll beyond that. But with this oracle to Philistia, notice the final verses. So the messengers, part of the envoy coming from Philistia, talking to Hezekiah, who is now the ruler, the sole monarch, no longer co-regent, in the stead of his father Ahaz, who marks the beginning of this oracle, as goes his death. These messengers wanting to, I guess, maybe have some concessions, an easing of the burden of what they have to pay, the tributary offerings and so forth, given over to them and whatnot. So what answer will be given to those messengers from that nation? The Lord has founded Zion, and his oppressed people will find refuge in her. Oftentimes our brains are trained to read that phrase, people or his people, and we can insert the word oppressed people as being exclusively Hebrew, Abraham's descendants. But the understanding is that Isaiah is building a theme for us with the idea in mind that God's people are more than just ethnic Israel. God's covenant people are those who are his redeemed, regardless of what nation they come from. That is evidenced very clearly in chapter 2. So how are we to integrate all of this from chapter 2, 4, moving on through 7 and 9 with these beautiful messianic promises, and the last little bit that was given to Philistia in the closing of 14 before we jump into 15, that now, as he is condemning Philistia to judgment, and that judgment will come, yet there can be refuge found, but where? Zion. Why Zion? Because it's what he said in chapter 2. In the age of Messiah, that is where all the nations will come. So there will be refuge offered to you, but it will not be in your homeland.
If you want to be where refuge is, you will be where God is, with God's people, right? But of course, in these days, that's primarily, if not exclusively, going to be seen as only ethnic Israel, which that creates a problem for Philistia, considering the centuries-long issues and differences that they've had with each other, and the fact that their exchanges have never really been diplomatic and almost always militant. And so for one to have to capitulate to the other, to say, I have to find refuge in your land when we hate each other, is a big obstacle to overcome. So that is going to spill over into what we're going to cover tonight with respect to the oracle or the Massah, the burden against Moab. All right, so Moab, as you can clearly see, and I pulled this map off the internet, and I think they did a pretty good job spelling the names of most of these kingdoms, but it just has to be fortuitous that the one kingdom we have to point to tonight is misspelled, and it's a 4-letter word. So it's not the kingdom of Moab, as it says on the map. It is indeed Moab. Nonetheless, there's not a lot of hefty theological stuff in these chapters. And so I'm not really going to be spending our time tonight pointing out deep theological secrets or connections to other places in Scripture that have been a little bit more reticent for us in earlier chapters. Instead, I want us to focus a little bit more on the stylized structure of this. So when we read it, our eyes just don't simply gloss over because we're reading place names and it's like, well, who cares about any of this stuff because I don't know where these places are, right? Always a good Bible atlas would help with respect to this, but we understand too that not every Bible atlas is cut from the same cloth, and some of them are a little bit more definitive in their assertions of where things are. Some of them are a little bit more honest with respect to drawing out where a place could be, but putting a question mark there, recognizing that the best scholarship that we have to date and the best study in the sciences of archaeology, paleontology, still have not defined with 100% confidence that any of these ancient places that are nothing but ruin now, for the most part, are indeed the places we have coming to us in Scripture passages like this. But all that to say, when we read through chapter 15, we're going to see a lot of place names. Why? What is the point of mentioning all of these place names? Especially for people like us who don't know where they are, and future generations may very well not. Because after the time of Babylon's conquest in this portion of the land, Moab will not exist as a kingdom anymore. Now, many of these places may still exist if someone went back to resettle those areas, if it was completely destroyed, which was a moniker of the way Babylon and Assyria did business. So if nobody built on those ruins, but instead recycled the products that were available to them as raw materials and resources to just build something new somewhere else, or on top of that, and maybe even name it something else altogether, those ruins of these places now may very well still be locked under the sand somewhere, or not even anything there left to be found. But having said that, this was significant for those people who would first hear these oracles of Isaiah and understand as he's naming these places off what is in store for Moab. All right, so Ar in Moab is devastated, destroyed in a night. Kir in Moab is devastated, destroyed in a night. Now, Kir, as a Hebrew word, actually itself means city. So it wouldn't be an uncommon thing in biblical literature or other literature contemporary to the time written in Semitic language, especially Hebrew, for Kir to be a prefix followed by a hyphen and then some other word as a name behind that to say this is the city of whatever. So to just simply give the name Kir could very well mean in this poetic device, as Ar apparently is a prominent place, that Isaiah is forecasting that if Ar is going to fall, many cities will fall, connotated by the use of this word Kir. Does that make sense? And of course, that seems to be borne out in the rest of the verses that follow here, because again, city after city will be named all throughout the land, north, south, east, west. If you could plot them points out on the map, you'll see there really isn't a section of Moab that is going to escape this. All right. So what is a little difficult, though, to understand is this the coming Assyrian or Babylonian invasion? Now, right away, we as biblical students might say, well, does it matter? No, it doesn't, because either way, they're going to suffer. The Assyrians are going to come through town, and they're going to do their business in Assyria, and they will not play nice, and they will do some very terrible damage, but Moab will continue to limp on. We know this from the historical records that survive from the time, In fact, the Assyrian king who comes through there, whether it's Tiglath-Pileser III, and we should all know that name right now, because he's our new best friend. As goes, we read this material, it's like, yep, know that guy, I know what he's about, and what he's going to be doing. He did come through the land, but it could have very well been Sennacherib in the future days of Hezekiah. It's hard to say, but there are some historical records, somewhat contemporary to this rather broad time frame of a few decades, that state one of these Assyrian kings put the king of Moab in a tributary vassal status, so that the king of Moab now is not paying tribute to any Israeli or Judean king, but the Assyrian emperor. But when Babylon came to town, after they did their business there, and then of course destroyed all the rest of these kingdoms that were left behind by Assyria, and then took over everything Assyria had already staked a claim out of, Moab disappears from the historical record altogether. There is no nation group referred to by either themselves or anybody else as the kingdom of Moab from this point on. It doesn't mean it's not inhabited anymore. It just does not go by that name. But it does seem to fit a little bit more with the Assyrian timeline, considering the other people groups that we will see or encounter mentioned in these chapters, especially given the fact that Aram and Israel as a northern kingdom are going to be addressed here. And so if this is Babylon coming to town to destroy Moab, that's already happened. There is no more Israel, and there is no more Aram, because Assyria has already done their business with them decades before, over a century before. So this would seem to fit a little bit more with that, if that helps you better understand this. Again, in the end, it doesn't matter, I suppose, to the extent that destruction's coming, and both of these peoples will have a hand in that. So Dibon, and Dibon is the capital of Moab. You might notice that by that little red star above the phrase Kingdom of Moab. Dibon went up to its temple to weep at its high places, and every head is shaved, every beard is chopped short. We kind of discussed that in weeks past, referencing the story of David going to the newly crowned king of Ammon, trying to garner a close friendship with him that he already had with his father who just passed, and the way that those emissaries were treated at the hands of the newly crowned king. And does anybody remember what they did to David's emissaries or messengers? How they humiliated them? That's right. So when we read these phrases, that every head is shaved, every beard chopped short, what would we immediately have come to mind then? Humiliation, shame, which if it's not done on the part of someone else, meaning someone else did not forcibly do this, but a person took the razor to their own face and head, then this could be a sign of humiliation as well. But also we would then think in the terms of what? Sorrow, mourning, right? In fact, this becomes a bit more qualified in the next statement. It's streets, they wear sackcloth. It's rooftops, public squares, everyone wails. So to go up to Dibon, to its temple, its high places, they are evoking their gods, and the chief of their pantheon, Chemosh. They're evoking their gods with signs of deep reverential mourning, probably over the fact that the northern parts of their land perhaps are the first to be invaded. That would seem to make strategic sense. From any one of these invading hordes, Assyria or Babylon, they're going to come in the same direction. And so if that's the case, and Dibon is up there in the north, whether they are evoking their gods as they realize the coming horde is about to encroach upon their land and cross their borders, and then if they are indeed sweeping north to south, starting at Dibon and then destroying that place, there are other high places to worship their gods, hence probably the reason that they're mentioned here. All that to simply say, what can they expect to be the response on the part of their gods? Salvation or destruction? Well, since if there are some measure of spiritual entity entreated here in all of this, exactly, they're powerless to do anything because it's God's hand that has appointed this against Moab, and nothing will stand in the way of preventing that. Finishing off the last part of verse 4, since much of what is contained in between verses 2 and 4 is much of the same. Therefore the soldiers of Moab cry out, and they tremble. If the soldiers are crying out and trembling, this obviously is nothing more than just the clear understanding this is a demoralized and very devastated army that virtually at this point lacks the strength or the will to stand up against the invading hordes, Assyrians, Babylonians, whoever, coming into the land. And then lastly, I just highlight Heshbon and Elah, because we have the mention of Ar, Ker, Dibon, Heshbon, and Elah as cities, again, all spread throughout the kingdom of Moab, as an understanding that the entirety of the kingdom is going to be affected by this. So now, reading through the rest of what we have here in verses 5 through 9, we first hear this. My heart cries out over Moab. So when we get to verse 5 and we have prophet speaking the oracle, and he says, my heart cries out over Moab, what might leap into our minds as goes, who is the person saying it's their heart?
Isaiah.
Okay, so we have one that said God and one that said Isaiah. Both would be great answers. The question is how do we qualify that? How do we know? And I think, you and I probably share this same experience with respect to our level of curiosity. Sometimes when we're reading, irregardless of whatever context it is in the Bible, sometimes we encounter pronouns and we kind of lose track of who's talking here. Whose voice are we actually hearing? And that can be difficult to tease out, and this is no exception to that rule. So in asking the question, whose heart, is it Isaiah's or is it Yahweh's? I think an answer becomes a little bit clearer when we go down to verse 9, which I know we're not there yet, but just to kind of dispel this. Notice in verse 9, the waters of Dibon are full of blood, but I will bring upon Dibon even more than this. So waters being turned to blood is a clear sign of what? Slaughter, okay. And slaughter usually in this context would be a sign of what? What's working in the background to bring such a horrific slaughter that it's actually polluting bodies of water? This is God's what? It's judgment, that's right. So if God's bringing judgment, and then we go to the second line of this verse, and it says, and I will bring upon Dibon even worse judgment than this. So if God's the one bringing the judgment, and the pronoun in verse 9 is the very same one that we see in verse 5, there's nothing that transpires between 5 and 9 that changes the framework of the pronoun to someone else, then this is God's heart that's being spoken of in verse 5. So let's read that with the understanding. My heart cries out over Moab, whose fugitives flee as far as Zoar, which means they're going from the north all the way down to the southern tip of the Dead Sea, where the cities of the plains once were in the days of Lot, before God destroyed them all, right? Just a salt desert, a wasteland, a place of God's judgment that's been intergenerationally remembered from eons past. But to hear God say, my heart cries out over Moab, what does that mean? What does that connotate about God in regards to a people that are not in covenant relation with Him?
He don't want a match for anybody on the race. He wants everybody to turn to him.
I mean, He says this through Ezekiel more than once. Do you think I delight in the death of the wicked? No, not at all. And this is almost the lamenting of a father of having to execute a just punishment upon his children because they have deserved it, and to do anything less would be to continue to coddle them and prove himself to be unjust, and ultimately something of a liar if he's only ever promised justice and judgment along the way as punishments for what their infractions, their rebellions, their transgressions are. And beyond that, if he's the one who is charged with the justice of the cosmos, to let any one people group continue to just blaspheme his goodness and do nothing about that at any point in time would be to forfeit his responsibility and his place as God, as being the one who ultimately is charged with making sure that justice prevails in the end, that he is the highest good, and that because of the fact he is the highest good, he is charged with making sure that good in the end wills out over evil, which is not his creation, right? So it's massive to come at this from the angle then that God is weeping over Moab, which from a completely secularized standpoint, a skeptical standpoint, one could easily ask or surmise, well, then why is he doing this? You know, you don't want to spank your kid? Don't spank your kid. Whatever floats your boat as a parent. But we also find in this very same book, meaning Scripture in total, in places like Proverbs where we're told to be a parent and to spare the rod for your child is to ultimately prove that you hate them. It's your measure of contempt for them, not love. And so God is doing this as a means of chastising them to purify them, perhaps for some greater purpose than what ultimately they're going to be experiencing now.
Jason,
Yes, sir.
so if we look at these prophecies that Isaiah has given of the judgment and destruction of these kingdoms around Israel that are to come, and we see God weeping over that for this in the purpose of this verse 5. So could we say that because Israel was supposed to bless blessed. They have failed, and the judgment for Israel is to destroy these nations. So Israel is no longer dependent on these nations. There's no more nation to be dependent on, work through, work with. And therefore God is having to destroy these nations to send judgment on the Israel. And we know that, because we know we have Babylon is the ultimate destruction for Israel. God has given them these moments even before Syria, after Syria, these nations. Now he's taking these nations away from Israel. They're no longer able to bless these nations, which God intended. So can we say that God's brokenness is from the disobedience of Israel?
I would say it's probably multifaceted. I would say it's that, coupled with the fact on the individual level that every one of these are sons of Adam, individual image bearers, both man and woman, who have ultimately chosen in their hearts to walk away, and as Paul lays out very clearly in the context of Romans 1, give the glory that belongs to him to his creation, instead of ascribing it to him, to images they make versus being the image bearer that he made them to be. But certainly, that's the reason why every one of these slides are titled, Judah's Hope Rests in Yahweh Alone, for this very reason. Because if it's not the first wave of assault, Assyria coming through, that takes away a good portion of these northern territories from Aram all the way down through the northern kingdom of Israel, then it will be Babylon as that final juggernaut that's going to destroy all the rest of it. And it's kind of funny because they systematically work their way around Judah, and Judah is almost, not quite, but almost the last man standing. And by virtue of that, and even things that happened before the outright destruction of Egypt under Babylonian power, and granted they had been conquered by Assyria as well, but all that to simply say that he makes it very clear in the geopolitical movements of all of these conflagrations that Judah has no one to lean on. In fact, Isaiah will use these words later on, I believe, when he speaks about Assyria being like a bruised reed, that if one were to stick their hand on, it's going to stick through their hand and punish them for trying to do so, leaning on them, as it were, for any sort of militaristic aid, especially considering that a Pharaoh will come to power during this time period. And one of the first things this Pharaoh attempts to try to do is assert his power and presence throughout the southern portion of Palestine or the Levant by going to the Philistines, Edom, and trying his best to promise all of them through grand overtures, when they come, you can call on Egypt. We'll be here with our armies. We'll be here with our money and resources. They help no one. They're not powerful enough to help anyone. And so by virtue of that, Judah is learning the lesson that they've known all along. Yahweh is their only hope. And you get that shining beacon moment in Hezekiah's story when Judah has basically been devastated through the Assyrian onslaught of Sennacherib. All their fortified cities are overtaken. Jerusalem now stands alone as being the last bastion of hope. And Hezekiah walks into the temple, throws the letter out before the Lord, weeps and wails and prays for God's deliverance. And that night, the Assyrian army is spoiled. So why not after that would other kings follow in the same example? Hardness of heart, right? But yes, you're onto something there. Absolutely, 100%. That God is taking these crutches away from them so that they learn the last lesson before they go off into exile. Yahweh is their only hope. So then we got a lot more names that pop up here, right? Zoar, Eglath-Shalashah, Horonaim, Nimrim, Eglaim, Bir, Alim, and Dibon mentioned again. Again, points littered all throughout the land itself to show us nothing is going to escape. But now we get an interesting picture, verse 6. So the waters of Nimrim are desolate. The grass is withered. The foliage is gone. The vegetation has vanished. So why the use of these botanical images? What's supposed to be in the forefront of our minds when we read something like that? Garden, exactly. So what we're getting here is a picture of Eden space ravaged. Now you might ask them, well, hold on now. We're talking about the kingdom of Moab. The whole concept of Eden imagery and space being revived is almost exclusive for the land of Israel, right? Land flowing with milk and honey, Exodus 3, and then the imagery inside the temple itself. But then again, the temple is not unique in the sense that there's no other structure like it at this time. In fact, much study has been done, especially by biblical scholars, in understanding from ancient Near Eastern sources that predate the Isaiah scroll, that are contemporary more so to the time of much earlier Hebrew works and whatnot, describing ancient Near Eastern temples, and ones that have been excavated thoroughly. That there's a lot of imagery that is shared in context between Israel's temple and those temples. Israel's not copycatting off of those. It all comes from the same truth core of the understanding of the Tower of Babel complex and what Eden was ultimately trying to image with respect to sacred space where God and man dwell together, with the idea of a most holy or sacred space or shrine in the deep inner sanctum of a temple, whether it's an Assyrian temple, an Ammonite temple, an Egyptian temple, or a Hebrew temple. They're almost all the same in that regard. Doesn't mean all the rest of the trappings are going to be the same. But it wouldn't be an odd thing for them to have things like images of palm trees or gourd plants or whatever the case might be carved into the reliefs, or actually sitting there as goes live specimens or whatnot, to decorate the place, not just for the sake of making it beautiful, but to bring it back to the understanding, like Baal and Asherah, commonly worshipped in the same space. You would see a very beautiful gardened shrine. I was trying to say an enshrined garden. I'll get it out in a second. An enshrined garden around that altar space. Why all the beautification with the leaves and plants and whatnot? What did Asherah and Baal get out of that? Well, it's what they were responsible for as deities with respect to fertility and whatnot. So again, it's not an uncommon thing. Take that over into Moab, it's the same idea. But if you're looking at it through a Hebrew lens, that's the idea. Moab are distant relatives to Israel, right? Does anybody in here remember the ancestral origins of Moab? Who's his father? Bible Trivia 101. Got a Tootsie Roll in my pocket for anybody that can answer it. It's warm and squishy. I'm joking, I don't have a Tootsie Roll. I wish I had a lot of Tootsie Rolls in my pocket. There, I just gave you the name. Lot! There we go. Man, you guys are so smart. Yeah, Lot. Lot's the father of Moab. So, incestuous origin nonetheless, but remember the promise that God makes to Moses and the people when they're traipsing through this part of the land to get to their staging area for the conquest journey into Israel. You're not to go and provoke Moab to war. This is their land that I gave them. Now that to some degree seems to be reneged on in the time of David, right? Because he has a few military conflicts there and he subdues them and brings them in line with the kingdom of Israel. Now he doesn't go colonize the area, but what could have potentially happened is in generations subsequent to that, maybe, just maybe, the promise and blessing of Abraham would have filtered beyond the borders of Israel into Moab, and Moab would have left worshiping Chemosh and put aside their differences, recognizing the covenantal extension of that blessing from Abraham to Lot in the stories of their people, and then eventually come to bow the knee to Yahweh. But sadly, it never reached beyond just conquest of Moab. And now Moab is being devastated for, I would see it as another application of what Gary just said. Part of the reason why Yahweh yearns and pours his heart out over Moab is because the reason they are there where they're at now is partly due to the failings of Israel. Had Israel fulfilled their mandate, this song would not have to be sung over Moab.
So not to go back, people ask, but why exactly is his heart crying out over Moab? What did we say that?
I would say there's lots of points to it, but I would say if there's one clear takeaway, hopefully we should all be able to just grab, is the idea that it's because of the fact he's got to punish them for the sin that they're responsible for.
So
And it grieves the heart of God.
So is it like grieving? Is it like Genesis 6 then?
Yes, I think so. I mean, and what's my opinion? It doesn't matter. I, from the scholarly sources I've read, that seems to be the idea, is that it touches the heart of God from that perspective, if nothing else. But I think that there are more layers wrapped around that. But that's probably the core essence of it. So they carry their wealth and belongings over the Wadi of the Willows, which I know you all know exactly where that's at on the map, right? Anybody could point to it, no problem. We're actually going to discover that here in a second. But the question then would be, well, if they're carting their wealth and belongings, where are they going? Apparently, this is like an exodus of sorts, like Israel leaving Egypt. They're carting up their belongings, what they can grab and go. But if they're going somewhere, where are they going to go? How will you escape this, right? The waters of Dibon are full of blood. Now, I think this is a kind of neat, I won't say fun, because saying fun makes it sound like there's something rewarding from it, but it's really not. But neat as a bit of an aside here. I think an allusion to 2 Kings chapter 3, and you're like, well, what's that story about? Let's just read these verses real quick. So, then he said, this is Elisha speaking, to the triumvirate kings of Israel, Judah, and Edom, coming to do battle against the king of Moab, because Ahab's dead and the king of Moab's tired of paying tribute, so he rebels against his tributary vassal status against Israel. This is what the Lord says: dig ditch after ditch in this wadi. Now, I'm not saying this is the Wadi of Willows. We're not told what wadi this is. Anyway, but the wadi will be filled with for the Lord says, you will not see wind or rain, but the wadi will be filled with water, and you will drink, you and your cattle and your animals. This is easy in the Lord's sight. He will also hand Moab over to you. Then you will attack every fortified city and every choice city. On and on he goes. And then we get down to verse 20. About the time for the grain offering the next morning, water suddenly came from the direction of Edom and filled the land. So all Moab's waking up, and they had heard that the kings had come to fight against them. So all who could bear arms, from the youngest to the oldest, were summoned, and they took their stand at the border. When they got up early in the morning, the sun was shining on the water that now filled this wadi and all the little tributary ditches that they dug the previous day. The Moabites saw that the water across from them was red like blood. This is blood, they exclaimed. The kings have crossed swords, and their men have killed one another. So to the spoil, Moab. However, when the Moabites came to the Israelites' camp, the Israelites attacked them, and they fled from them. So Israel went in the land attacking the Moabites. And it's odd now that Isaiah is bringing this back up and saying that this is going to be the byproduct of the devastation that will be brought by the invading horde, is that the waters of Dibon will be filled with blood. It was a metaphor the first time around, as it was literally nothing but water in these ditches that somehow got there without the natural resources of wind, cloud, rain. But now it's for real. Indeed, a preceding forecasting sign of judgment that centuries later would come to be fulfilled in the time of Isaiah and the kingdom of Assyria or Babylon. So now we're done with 15. Any questions on that chapter before we move over to 16? Okay. So we're still dealing with Moab. We haven't changed perspectives. Here we start out with send lambs to the ruler of the land from Selah. So Selah is actually in the kingdom of Moab. It's not their capital city. Mount Seir is one of their more sacred sites and is referenced more so than Selah, but it is a place in the kingdom of Edom, which, if you notice on the map, shares a border south by southwest with Moab. Send them from Selah in the desert to the mountain of daughter Zion. So a question would be then, what ruler? What land? If you had to give an answer right now, what would your answers be?
Edom.
Okay, so it could be Edom. After all, I mean, if they're escaping, it would make sense. You got to cross your border at some point if you're going to get out of your land, and that would be a natural progression if they're being attacked from the north, systematically, north to south, to flood out of the land in a south direction, and so going into the land of Edom. Plus, we have one of Edom's cities being mentioned. Okay, so Edom's one answer. Any other answers? Well, let's find out. So notice, I'm going to back the slide up just for a second because what happened on there you might not have noticed. So I'm going to focus your eyes on the Dead Sea, and just in case we're all wondering where that's at, that's right there. So, Dead Sea. So notice on the very bottom tip of the Red Sea. Boop, that little pigtail that just popped out there. This is where scholarly consensus is that the Wadi of Willows was most likely. And so if we were told that they have carted up their belongings, what they can grab, and they're going to cross over the Wadi of Willows, and this is indeed where it is, they're traipsing through the land of Edom. But we understand from the third line of verse 1, to the mountain of daughter Zion. Where's that? What is that? It's a mountain. Yeah, exactly. Because Zion is Jerusalem. So this seems to be the terminal end then. Who is the ruler reigning in Jerusalem? I'm not asking necessarily for a proper name, but obviously a king, and he's descended from whom? David. So the ruler of the land would be a son of David, resting and ruling in Zion, here referenced, daughter Zion, as a mountain. So they're going to migrate over that wadi and then eventually come up into the land, making a beeline straight for Jerusalem. And now let's find out what else is said here. So these words here in verse 3, all verbs, give, shelter, hide, which extends on down into verse 4. But all of these are directed squarely at daughter Zion. It's the plea on the part of the prophet for the people, as if the people are talking through the prophet, asking for these things. It's almost like a pseudo-dialogue, pseudo in the sense that it may not be real. There may not be actual emissaries who are coming from Moab to entreat the king of Judah in this way. So he might not be describing an actual dialogue that takes place, but what could potentially take place as the offer is being made to Moab, which we'll discover a little bit more here in a second. But nonetheless, the plea is to give us, shelter us, hide us as refugees, right? So, continuing on in verse 3 then, give us counsel, make a decision. You're like, well, what does that mean? Make a decision on what? Well, if the people are migrating up to the mountain of daughter Zion and are going to talk to the ruling monarch, the son of David, and they're going to ask for protection as refugees, then naturally a choice has been set before the king, and he's got to decide to do what?
Protect them or
Or what?
slaughter them.
Slaughter them, or you cannot stay here. Get out. One of the two, which either form of those would be exile. One far worse than the other, obviously. So give us counsel. What should we do? What will you do? And make a choice. So the question then becomes, will the king provide refuge for Moab? They ask then, shelter us at noonday with shade that is as dark as night. Get the poetic picture here. When is the sun the hottest? At noonday. But they're asking that they shade them with shelter that is as dark as night to assuage the burning torment of the heat of the conflagration they're facing with respect to the onslaught of the Assyrians, Babylonians, whoever coming into the land. Please protect us and prevent that heat from fully overtaking us, right? That's the idea. So then we go back to the reference of chapter 4. Like Yahweh will provide in Zion, right? Provide shelter from the heat of the day. When you come here to seek refuge in Zion, that's the idea, is that God is going to protect these wayfaring travelers. And we have these kinds of pictures spread all throughout books of the Bible, especially in the Psalms, when we revive this kind of Exodus language, and we get pictures like pillar of fire by night, smoke, or cloud by day, or anything else that speaks back to the journey of Israel wandering through the wilderness and how God provided with food, provided water, provided shelter, even in the midst of the heat of the day. A place like Psalm 91, right? That the blight of the day will not smite you. The plagues will not come upon you, that sort of thing. So all the way back to chapter 4, when the branch comes and he beautifies Mount Zion and he provides that Exodus-like protection over the summit of the mountain for all people to rally to him there, there's the chance for Zion to do this now to their kin, their own relatives. These people aren't really strangers to them. They've always had a blood relation. The question is what will the king do? The end of verse 4. Again, pleading from the standpoint of Moab, let my refugees stay with you, be a refuge for Moab from the aggressor. So will the king provide as Yahweh does? Will the king inculcate the character, the sovereign provisionary status of Yahweh as Israel's king is supposed to do as a shepherd over his own people? Will he be a shepherd to those outside of him? This brings huge level of connection to what we've already seen, but just briefly hinted at, but we're going to see expounded upon a lot more and way deeper in future parts of this scroll with respect to the servant who was also subsequently identified as this branch shooting off from the stump of Jesse, who is the child born to us in Isaiah 9, who has the government of the world on his shoulders, and all those lofty names that describe who he is, that he indeed will be a new David, who will be a king and priest and a shepherd for his people, but not just his people. As will be said in Isaiah 49, it is not enough for you to come and restore the broken houses of my people, Israel and Judah. I will make you a light to the nations. So, the ruler of Israel, or Judah, has the chance for this now. Moving on to verses 5 through 8, we are told, a throne will be established in love. So, this is a mark of the coming kingdom and king. Notice that. So far the dialogue has been on the part of the Moabite emissaries, or the Moabite peoples themselves, seeking refuge in the land of Judah, bringing tributary offerings, lambs to send as gifts, kind of like in the days of the patriarchs, a custom that apparently is still extant even now for them to do something like that. When I mean now, I don't mean in our day. I just mean now in the moment of Isaiah speaking this. But this is future tense. So a throne is already established at daughter Zion, right, on her mountain summit. The adopted son of the Lord, the son of David by progeny, has been seated at his right hand in his palace besides the Lord's palace since the days of Solomon. But we're speaking about a different throne, apparently. This throne will be established in love, and the one who will sit on it will do so continually. In the CSB it says faithfully, but that superscript up there is to connote the fact it's perpetual, which brings to mind the words of contemporaries of Isaiah or future prophets such as Daniel, that the one who, like a son of man, ascends on the clouds into the very presence of the Ancient of Days, who has arrayed his court there in Daniel's sight, to waylay the beasts that come out of the sea, and that fourth and nasty one that was not like any of the rest of those beasts. And as he's thrown down and slain, and this Son of Man exalted to the presence of the Ancient of Days, is conferred upon a kingdom with dominion and glory that will never end, and he will never pass it to another king after him. Centuries before that, Isaiah is speaking about the throne he will sit on, firmly established in Hesed, love for all the nations, reviving the broken tent of David, and he will do so continually. And the very characteristics of David's earlier time as king, once he unites Israel, judging and pursuing what is right, echoing the words of chapter 11, when the Spirit of the Lord comes upon him, and he will rule and reign and exercise justice and righteousness, which we quote there from chapter 9. He will reign on the throne of David over his kingdom to establish it and sustain it with justice and righteousness from now on and forever. So he's not only the saving grace for the fallen kingdom of Judah and its destroyed city Jerusalem that will come in the days ahead, but now also apparently for Moab. Because why offer this advice to Moab to say, hey guys, it kind of stinks to be in your shoes, and we're kind of feeling that heat ourselves. But guess what? We have an awesome out for us, because one day we're going to have a coming king who is going to rule over us in righteousness and justice, and we're going to have an unprecedented age of prosperity that's like going back to the Garden of Eden. But I don't know about you guys, so I guess just make the best of it. Why speak this way about these things to Moab if Moab is not intended to be included in that, right? So the question now becomes, now that we've reached the end of this little introduction to Moab, her plight, what is offered to her, and what is ultimately coming as the salvation for all mankind, how will Moab respond to the prospect of refuge in the land of their distant kin? It's one of two choices. Either they will choose to come, or they won't. What does verse 6 say? So we have heard of Moab's pride, how very proud he is, his haughtiness, his pride, his arrogance, and his empty boasting. So for the speaker, Isaiah, to take such a turn in describing Moab in such a negative way, speaking of their pride, their arrogance, their sense of haughtiness, sticking the nose up in the air, do you think that Moab seems to be ready to take this olive branch of peace and seek refuge in the land of Zion and become in some ways subject to their king for the sake of not only their own salvation but their own prosperity and redemption? Or do you think that they might try to find better suitings elsewhere? So seemingly the way they're going to respond is with unyielding pride that will refuse the offer and thereby consign them to judgment. So verse 7, therefore let Moab wail. Now we've already heard that phrase. Moab is going to wail. So it's kind of strange to hear that Moab is going to wail and then therefore let Moab wail again. But what has transpired between those references? This offer of the chance of their redemption, but they spit it back. They don't want that. They, in some way, think that they can survive without God's offer to them of ultimate salvation away from their oppressors and captives. So here in verse 7, we're going to get the first of 3 therefore statements. Now, the reason why I bring this up is because I've started something with you guys that I hope you're kind of beginning to ingrain in your mind. Go back to chapter 5. Always use chapter 5 as the rubric, the standard for this. Because remember in chapter 5, we have the pronouncement of the vineyard, the oracle and song of the vineyard, right, at the beginning in the first few verses. Then after that, the rest of that lengthy chapter dispels what God found and what he's going to do to the garden. And we get this formula: 2 woes, 2 therefores, 4 woes, and then 2 more therefores. And it's poetically stylized like that to show pronouncements of judgment, and then the therefores qualify why. Why? Judgment, and then what God is going to do in the judgment. So when we have the command to wail, meaning judgment's going to come, and then a therefore, our minds should be linking these things together. God is about to explain why he's going to judge Moab. And then he's perhaps going to give us something as of a hint as to how he's going to judge Moab. So therefore let Moab wail. And let them wail for the raisin cakes of Kir Harosheth, another city. But really? I mean, wail over some raisin cakes? Anybody in here actually have a predilection, a hankering for raisins? Like you just love the things, can't get enough of them? My kids think that they're about on the same level as rat excrement. They can not stand the sight of raisins.
I kind of agree with you.
Really? Yeah.
Exactly.
You know, I like oatmeal raisin cookies, but I guess, I wouldn't pull a box of raisins out of the cabinet and I remember getting those things as kids and absolutely hating those Sun-Maid raisin boxes or whatever you open up and you're like, really, this is the...
That's always a grandma's snack. I guess it was cheap.
Yeah. And I guess it didn't matter how stale they got, they still tasted the same, right?
Yeah.
And the idea is that this is what if you can take one of those little red boxes and envision it in your mind now and pop the little tabs off the top and then push your finger to the bottom side to get that whole big clump of raisins out on the table, that's kind of the idea of a raisin cake. Like a raisin cake, you should not be thinking is dough with raisins embedded in it. A raisin cake is just compressed raisins. That's all this is. So who would cry over that? Right? That's not the stuff dreams are made of. But the question is why cry over it, and what do we find in verse 8? Move beyond this. Because Heshbon's vineyard, terraced vineyards, and the grapevines of Sibmah have withered. The rulers of the nations have trampled its choice vines that reached as far as Jazer and spread out to the desert. Their shoots spread out and reached the sea. Oh, so wait a minute. Raisins are just dehydrated what? That grow on what? Right. And so we get this qualified further, this poetic stylization in verse 8, that Heshbon has terraced vineyards. So apparently laid out in row upon row where they harvest grapes to make succulent wine that people no doubt buy, trade out in markets, whatever the case might be. And yet again, we have this picture of what appears to be, given the botanical references, a garden that's laid waste to. And how is it laid waste to? This follows on in the therefore. Rulers of nations. So we understand this is through imperial might. We need to make sure that we understand when we hear the phrase ruler of nations, usually in Isaiah, but we'll hear it in other places in the Bible. This is imperial language. How do we know it's imperial language? Because we know from history and from other places that it's referenced, Moab and other people who will become the victims of rulers of the nations, they fall because of an empire that came and squashed them like a bug. So how does an emperor become an emperor? And how does his kingdom go beyond just a kingdom of his ancestors and of his terrestrial realm that they ruled over for generations and become an empire? You conquer a bunch of other kingdoms, and you take kings and depose them, and you make their kingdoms your kingdom. And now you rule over an empire. And maybe you have vassal kings who respond to your every will and command, or else they will lose their lives, right? It's the understanding in these suzerain vassal treaties that are entered into. that have been going on for centuries before even Isaiah's time. Even some elements of that, maybe even in the covenant treatises that God makes with Abraham way back in Genesis. All that to simply say, the rulers of nations, as part of conscripted armies to give more girth, power, and resource to the Assyrian army, now being used to destroy her foes and increase her empire and its holdings, right? And with that, what we have is the picture of another Eden or more Eden space devastated. So it's just turning the prism and seeing this angle of judgment from a different perspective. All right? Moving on through verses 9 through 13. So I join with Jazer to weep for the vines of Sibmah. I drench Heshbon and Elealeh with my tears. Triumphant sounds have fallen short or silent over your summer fruit and your harvest. So here we have in verse 9, so I join with Jazer. Who? Isaiah or Yahweh? It's the same I as my in chapter 15, verse 5, and the same I of chapter 15, verse 9. In other words, when I asked that question a few slides ago, who is it? Isaiah or Yahweh? And I pointed to the pronouns. That's the verses I'm referencing. So we carry that forward here. It's the same I. God is saying, I take up the lament with Jazer, and I'm weeping for the vines of Sibmah. So not only is God weeping for the people of Moab, he's even weeping for the vines that are destroyed through the onslaught of the armies who are just going to come and traipse all over top of that. Why? Why does God care about, in this case, it's almost as literal as saying spilt milk?
Because it's a picture of his government. He's eating that.
That's exactly right. His creation. I mean, think about the words that he gives to the people through Moses. When you go and you do war against other people, you don't go chop down fruit trees. You're not at war with the land. Why would you do that? You don't bring devastation to the land the way that these other armies, especially Assyria, likes to do. So that's a part of it, as far as just the fact creation is being trampled on. But you're right, the idea of Eden space being destroyed. And we'll see this also in verse 11 where he says, therefore I moan like the sound of a lyre for Moab, as does my innermost being. My innermost being for Kir Heres. Now, back in the beginning of verse 9. So, this actually is the exact same Hebrew word as therefore. So here in verse 9 and 11, we get the second and the third therefore statements, just to make sure we're tracking with this. Now to verse 11. Therefore, I've already read that. So Yahweh mourns even for the nations he must consign to his wrath. That's what we have to clearly get from this, is this understanding. So when Moab appears and tires himself out on the high place and comes to his sanctuary to pray, as one has already said, it will yield nothing. It will do him no good. And they will try. Their efforts will be futile, as if they were trying to catch the wind. Right? They have had, and how sad this is, they've had the chance to join themselves to Yahweh's people and experience his redemption through them, over them. But instead, they're going to continue to go at it in the only way they know how, and that is to invoke their gods and beg Chemosh for his mercy. But it will be to no avail. So Moab, praying to their gods, refuge offered, spurned, turning to Chemosh instead. All right, that's the end of 16. Any questions?
Yeah, so at the beginning of chapter 16, when Isaiah is, it's pretty, he's actually just giving instructions for what Moab needs to do.
Right.
But actually, they didn't do what he suggested for them to do.
Not at all. Not at all. And they reap the whirlwind for it. So now we have a Massah concerning Damascus. Remember, again, Massah is burden. So if you see Damascus up there, way off to the north from the kingdom of Moab, and this is, of course, Aram Damascus. We understand these terms are synonymous with each other. So anytime Aram is being mentioned, Damascus is just her capital city, right? So look, Damascus is no longer a city. Now with that makes it sound as if the vantage point of the speaker here is looking at the devastation of Damascus. So one could easily argue, back to my original statement, that who is this invading Moab? The Assyrians? The Babylonians? Maybe this fits more with the Assyrian timeline, because if we're talking about the pending destruction of Damascus, the pending destruction of the northern kingdom of Israel, then it would have to go more with the Assyrian timeline, because the Babylonians don't do that. The Assyrians do. But if we're looking at this from the vantage point as if to say Damascus is already destroyed, then maybe that fits in from the vantage point of the Babylonian timeline, because by that point Damascus is a heap of ruins. Am I making sense? But this is just the prophet looking into the future and saying what has already been pronounced upon Damascus. When we go back to a place like Isaiah 8 or 7, when Shear-Jashub coming with Isaiah to calm down frantic Ahaz, and then he tells him, look, don't worry about these two smoldering sticks. They've spent their resources. Aram, Israel, they're not going to be able to stand against you. And in fact, in 65 years, Ephraim will be too weakened to even stand as a people. That's what the prophet goes on to say. Or maybe somebody parenthetically added that later on to help us understand that within a generation, these two kingdoms will be gone. In fact, the contents of 7 and 8 is to give us two different children by two different names, potentially, that signify the fact that by the time these little boys grow up to either be able to say mama or papa or eat solid enough food like curds and honey, these kingdoms, Aram and Israel or Ephraim, will be no more. So pronouncing the judgment and the finitude or the finality of it is just to simply say it's coming. To say, look, Damascus is no longer a city is not necessarily to say it's already a heap of ruin, but nonetheless pronouncing what will not be turned back, that God will make it a pile of ruin. So we need to understand that this predates the Assyrian destruction of Aram, or at least that seems to be the most scholarly consensus with respect to this. Going down to verse 3, the fortress disappears from Ephraim and the kingdom from Damascus. So now we see, once again, per Isaiah 7 and 8, now on into 17, the fates of these two kingdoms and their alliance with each other are tied together, that when the one falls, so will the other. And the remnant of Aram will be like the splendor of the Israelites. There would have been a time in Israel's past when that would have been a glaring compliment, to be like the splendor of Israel, God's people. Wow. Considering the house of Jacob and the state of disarray that they're in right now, which has been the legacy of their kingdom from Jeroboam until now, this is anything but a compliment. And Aram will be like the fate of Israel in that they will be scattered to the wind. They will be no more. Just to reiterate from chapter 8, I was then intimate with the prophetess, and she conceived and gave birth to a son. The Lord said to me, name him. Oh, it's our favorite name in the entire Bible, right? Maher-shalal-hash-baz. For before the boy knows how to call father or mother, the wealth of Damascus and the spoils of Samaria will be carted off to the king of Assyria. Now we go from Damascus over to Israel. Let us remember the reason why, as Gary was discussing earlier with us, that we are getting these pronouncements in sequence is to show kingdom after kingdom around Judah will fall. There will be no one for them to lean on to save them from the sweeping wave of judgment that God is going to bring. That Isaiah has already forecast. It's like the river Euphrates is going to be unleashed and turned southward against them to flow through the land of Israel and come into Judah, and it will overflood its banks and fill the entirety of their land. Who is the river Euphrates? The king of Assyria. So, got that whole big kingdom up there we're talking about. And on that day, man, this is like Isaiah's favorite phrase. He just sprinkles this thing everywhere. On what day? Right? There are multiple facets of the day of the Lord as days, separate days of the Lord, but he is squishing this all together. Not to say that it all happens at the same time. It's not the idea of simultaneity. It's just the simple concept that it's all being wrapped up together in one great big eschatological picture of the end of this current reality as goes the stage of these kingdoms in this geopolitical context, and the arrival of the kingdom that will end all kingdoms, per the child in Isaiah 9, on whose shoulders the government of the world rests, right? And what we have yet to get to in Daniel 9 is the small little stone that crushes the colossal image and grows up to be the mighty mountain that is seen from every vantage point on the map that fills the earth. And that actually is the same mountain Isaiah is talking about in Isaiah 2 as the mountain that all the nations will river up to the summit of to hear the word of the Lord. So on that day, the splendor of Jacob sadly is going to fade. What day are we talking about? The time of Assyrian destruction of Samaria. Notice these pictures here. Splendor, a healthy body. It almost invokes the imagery that we get in Isaiah 1, but of course he's not speaking about a healthy body as goes Judah and Jerusalem. It's a disease-ridden body. But this is exactly what he's going to be talking about with respect to Israel. It's going to go from this picture of splendor and health. It's going to fade. Its body is going to become emaciated. And actually that sense of emaciation, think of a body, as sad as it is to invoke these images, The pictures we've all seen in the textbooks of the Holocaust victims that were liberated from the concentration camps, starved to the point where their knee joints looked like the size of softballs. You could see their ribs poking through their skin. People so light that they weighed almost 45 to 50 pounds as full-grown adults. That's the idea of health stripped away from the body to this point. It's also the very image that's given of what will happen to Assyria that's pronounced in Isaiah 10 when God will judge them for them overreaching their bounds and failing to give God the glory for how he has used them. Verse 6, only gleanings will be left in Israel. Now, this is one of those customary terms that we have to be familiar with. But as people who are displaced in time and locale from the context of when these things were written and lived out, gleaning is not something we do these days. When you harvest fields, you get in a big old combine, and a machine does all that for you, and there's like nothing left when it's all said and done. Here, they have people who go through the fields and pick everything off by hand. And we remember from the law that was given through Moses and the beautiful story of Ruth meeting Boaz that in this practice, the understanding would be whether you're going through a field or getting fruit off a tree, there's going to have to be multiple passes because you won't get it all. But there's also sanction given for how this would be something of a welfare system for those people who would be supported off this, right? So only gleanings will be left. The gleanings are what is left after the first pass. You're not to go and meticulously comb and methodically pick everything out because there have to be something left behind for those who are the poor and underprivileged to have something. If you strip it clean, there's obviously nothing there for them. But there's only a sparse bit left. That's why it's so surprising to Naomi when Ruth comes home that day and she's got her apron just filled with over a bushel of grain because she's like, there's no way you could have picked this. I mean, a blind man wouldn't even leave this much stuff in the field. How in the world, right? So it's the idea that only a sparse bit will be left. So we take this back up to verse 5. It will be as if a reaper had gathered standing grain and his arm harvesting the heads of grain, as if one had gleaned heads of grain. So that means he's went through and picked it clean to the point where there is only the small particles that fall down underneath the foot and probably wouldn't be noticed when you stepped on them and is not worth trying to comb out of the mud or dirt to simply put in your bag. But you've got everything else of value off of it. That's a picture of devastation in considering how many people will be left behind when Assyria comes to conquer Israel and deport them away. As if an olive tree had been beaten, and at the top of the tree there's only 2 or 3 olives left at the uppermost spot where you would have to bring out the ladder or climb the branches to get up there and try to get, and nobody ever messes with those. They just wait for them to rot and fall off. 4 or 5 on its fruitful branches. It's a very sad picture. So the completeness of the effort in deporting these exiles. 7 through 11. On that day, people, let me get ahead of myself. There's going to be a lot of these on this slide here, so I'm going to have to click through these one at a time. On that day, people will look. But then again in verse 8, it says they will not look. So these are juxtaposed against one another for the sake of the contrast. And we as readers of Scripture need to appreciate these kinds of rhetorical devices, just as much as we have to notice when similes or metaphors are used, especially when we're using poetic language, right? Because it helps us orient whether or not we should be thinking of this literally or figuratively. So just understanding basic rules of grammar is important for us, which I struggle with sometimes because all that stuff just bled out of my head years ago. But nonetheless, verse 9. On that day, their strong cities, notice the words that come after that, will be abandoned, and become desolate. Verse 10, for you have forgotten the God of your salvation. I know it seems like I'm kind of jumping around to the different verses, but there's a reason why I'm drawing these words and phrases out for you, to make them stand out so that you understand why God is saying these things, all right? So to say that they've forgotten the God of their salvation goes back to verse 7. On that day, people will look to their Maker, and they will turn their eyes to the Holy One of Israel. Why does he say on that day they will look to him, the Holy One of Israel? Because in verse 10, they have clearly and completely forgotten him. It does not mean that they are not offering sacrifice. Even in the days of Ezekiel, when Judah is at its absolute zenith of apostasy, they are still faithfully offering offerings to Yahweh on his altar of burnt offering in the temple complex. they're also offering offerings to all these other shrines that they built inside the temple complex. So they never walk away in that idea. It's just the synchronicity of trying to put other gods on par with Yahweh and forgetting their covenant agreement with Him, their marital union with Him. You have failed to remember the rock of your strength. Now remember, when we see phrases like that, rock of your strength, we have to remember where they are originally contextualized, right? Part of that goes back to the original Exodus song. Standing there on the shores of the Red Sea, Moses leading the people saying, "The Lord is my strength, my song. He has become my salvation." There's no mention of a rock in that, but David takes that very language and moves that forward when he sings this beautiful song that is also not only 2 Samuel 22, but also Psalm 18, verbatim the exact same thing. "The Lord is my rock, my fortress, and my deliverer, my God, my rock where I seek refuge, my shield and the horn of my salvation, my stronghold, my refuge, and my Savior. You save me from violence." Speaking of God as His salvation is pulling this Exodus song language forward and then attaching to it the idea of David's militaristic fortress language of, "I take refuge in you, an impregnable fortress where no enemy can come and get me out of, where I am always safe." For Isaiah to say, "You have forgot the rock of your strength," is combining all of that together to say the source of your salvation, your exodus out of Egypt, the deliverance from the oppression that you suffered there for centuries. And not only that, but when you read the words of Ezekiel, Ezekiel makes it plain that they weren't picking up these idolistic practices after they left Egypt thinking, "Hey, we're free now. What should we do? Let's bow to the gods of Egypt," like we see in Exodus 32. They were already worshiping the gods of Egypt in Egypt. He speaks to them. I believe it's in Ezekiel 20. "I thought about bringing my destruction against you while you were in Egypt and destroying all of you there." Why? Because you were worshiping the gods of Egypt. But I didn't do that. "So that my name would not be profaned amongst the nations, I brought you out of Egypt to save you from that." Not to just simply save you from the taskmaster's whip, to save you from being consumed by the rampant idolatry you were already giving yourself over to. So, and obviously that's the context of what we have here in Isaiah's day when he speaks this way. Then we go on with the rest of this. "Therefore you will plant beautiful plants, you will set out cuttings from exotic vines. On that day that you plant, you will help them grow, and in the morning you will help your seed to sprout. But the harvest will vanish, and on the day of the disease and incurable pain." Again, more botanical language coming from the understanding that Moses in that victory psalm is saying God is going to plant them to become a beautiful vine to fill the land that He puts them in, i.e. Canaan. They're supposed to yield the fruit that's going to bless the nations, but all that's going to dry up and wither away. That's part of this. But now what is also seemingly baked into this that we might not readily understand is who is it that they've given their loyalty and allegiance to above all else besides Yahweh? Baal, right? In the days of Ahab, we've already now lived through the episodes of Jehoshaphat and Athaliah, Jehoram and all those kings and that queen who were intermingling the house of David with Ahab and the influence of Baalism becoming more prominent in the land of Judah at the time. All that to simply say, what have we already said in this lesson tonight about Baal and Asherah? What are they responsible for? Fertility. Not just the opening of the womb of women, but of beasts and the womb of the earth. There's a reason why Baal and Asherah are worshipped together at the same spot. And there's a reason why there are cultic shrines dedicated for the practice of male and female prostitution there. Because when you go up and you give your little bag of money and you make your sacrifice, you choose out a prostitute. And you have sex with that prostitute. Why? Because you're trying to get Baal to stop doing what he's doing and copulate with his female consort, to send the rains down. And what is the rains? But the semen that he impregnates the earth with in order for the crops to grow. So the idea is that they're helping their crops to grow by going and doing these profane things at these shrines to get Baal to do his thing so that they can have what they want from him. And God is saying that when the sprouts come forth, the harvest will vanish on that day of disease and incurable pain. So to finish this up, we're at our last slide. And then with this, as we've said before, right, we have been marching from 13 through 23, and now we're at the halfway point in 17, and at the very end of this chapter, we have a bit of a break in which we have a purview now of a judgment that's going to be broadcast to the nations. So we've had 6 nations going into this, and we're going to have 6 nations going out of this. So in the middle, this was stylistically arranged for the sake of helping us understand, not only at the midpoint of this little corridor, but it's to say, this is going to happen to all nations. Read the verses with me. The roar of many peoples. And notice how in verse 12, in lines 1 and 3, many peoples and nations being juxtaposed together. And they are described as the roaring of the seas and the rumble of rushing water. But what does God do with them? In verse 13, he rebukes them, and they flee far away. And ending in verse 14, and this is the fate of all those who plunder us, and the lot of those who ravage us. Now that's interesting, though, because what we have here is the understanding that the nations have come together. They are wailing and raging against God. But according to Psalm 2, they're also raging against God's king. Now, since Ahaz is dead, and his son Hezekiah now, as co-regent, has ascended to the throne, presumably that may be during the time frame in which this is being set, Hezekiah being one of the more better kings of Judah, especially considering someone like Ahaz or Hezekiah's own son, Manasseh. Having said that, though, they're raging against God's king, who, as we saw in the little pericope of Moab, was supposed to be the shelter, who would reach out with benevolence and mercy and love, has said over Moab to bring them in and to provide them refuge, shelter from the storm and onslaught of Assyria. Now, it's Moab's fault they choose not to take this. Why? Because they choose to rage too. But Assyria, representing a conglomerate of nations, is going to come as a raging tidal wave into the land. And sadly, Israel is going to be swept away in this. Judah is going to be greatly devastated, but not altogether consumed. But what does God say with regards to all nations who come to rage against him and his people? And this is the fate of those who plunder us. God rebukes them. As much as Jesus standing out there on the Sea of Galilee says, "Peace be still," and that water became calm. Because he is the one, as Job said, who walks, treads upon the waters. As Isaiah will say in future chapters, like 27, and Job will also hint at the idea, this great nasty sea serpent, Leviathan, this chaotic primordial monster who is the episode or the episodic center of so many of these ancient Near Eastern myths, of this monster that threatens to consume the order of creation that these ancient gods have brought into the mix. Slay that nasty beast, destroy that dragon, because he is the one who crushes the heads of this hydra-like animal, because only he treads the waves, and they respond to only him. But in this case, the waves are the people, and the nations bow their knee to his will. Moab is as much of a nothing as Assyria is as much of a nothing, as is Babylon, as are all kingdoms. All peoples will bow the knee to him at some point, and they will do his will, whether they choose to or not. But this is meant to be a message of hope for God's people, which, as we understand in the words of Isaiah, is not merely just ethnic Israel. This is anyone who chooses, after being drawn, to become part of his covenant family. So, it's actually 7:23. We got some time here for some questions. Anything on your mind from what we talked about tonight?
In chapter 10, so in chapter 10, when Isaiah prophesies about Assyria coming down, is this prophecy this is a prophecy prior to Assyria actually, it's a warning to Assyria. What they're about to do is crush all these kingdoms around them. So in chapter 10, he's focusing on Assyria and prophesying what's going to happen to them before they begin their campaign.
Mm-hmm.
Now that we began the campaign, so at the end of 17, when he talks about, I guess this is the time now that Syria has taken the northern kingdom, Israel, but stops at Judah. Judah's spared for a moment.
Mm-hmm.
Is that correct?
Mm-hmm. For about
When
10
he's
years.
talking about us.
Yep.
You know, he came, but when he says this portion of those who loot us, he's talking about Judah at this point.
I would say it's probably the us. It could be. I won't say that that's not the case. I would say perhaps another way of looking at this also are the people of God
Remnant?
whoever that may consist of. Because with Isaiah, he's one of the more prolific writers that speak in terms of remnant. He's already forecast that to us from chapter 7. He's already said that in a few other places after chapter 7, speaking about the fact a remnant will survive, return, whatnot. But all that to say, God's covenant people are the ones who apparently are protected in this way whenever the raging battle or the raging waves comes against them, whenever the seas of the people stand up against them, because this will also be the case for when the Babylonians come. The same fate that comes upon Assyria will be what is prescribed for Babylon, even though they come to do Judah in and are successful in that. But aside from that, they won't escape judgment. They will be rebuked and they will have to flee too, as God once again extends his hand out over the waters to part them, to draw his people out of the nations and bring them back to himself. So I would say, while on the one hand, on a smaller scale, we can say for Judah in this succinct moment, that probably would hold true. But on a larger scale, considering the breadth of the entirety of the scope of this scroll, it's the covenant people of God in a more drawn-out time period than just this particular moment. But that's a good way of looking at it and piecing it together.
Well, it appears at the end of verse 14 there that the destruction is not actually going to happen, but it does.
Mm-hmm.
Why is that?
So what I would say in regards to that is that...
Because it says come morning, there'll be no more,
Right.
but it doesn't stop.
That's true. And so it's hard for us to really situate when exactly is he talking about. From the contextual clues we've had in just the few chapters we've read tonight, it seems like all of this seems to march out better with the Assyrian timeline than it would be a Babylonian timeline, right? All that to simply say, if we're talking about Judah per se, then that certainly fits into the story of Hezekiah almost perfectly with what he describes here. I mean, at one time, Hezekiah is going into the temple, and when he cries out to the Lord, Isaiah is almost on his heels to come and tell him, this will not happen. They won't shoot so much as an arrow into this place. And then the very next morning, after the destroyer has come that night and took 185,000 lives that are part of that army, their forces are decimated. There is no chance for them laying siege to Jerusalem and conquering them. And they tuck tail and run. They go back to Assyria. It's not quite the way Sennacherib makes the story sound, but he certainly leaves off on that part about why he didn't just go ahead and take Jerusalem and make Judah a vassal state to him. All that to simply say, terror at night, gone in the morning. So it's easier for us then, I think, to look at this picture, again, like a prism, from every different angle we can to see when does this fit in, but not being stuck on just one angle to say this is right at that moment when Hezekiah and Judah are all being pent up, as Sennacherib says, like a bird in a cage.
Talk about Zion and stuff, but this is talking about the destruction of Jerusalem,
Mhm.
not Judah. You
Right.
know, I mean, so that's why, as you read that, it's hard to follow.
It is.
I mean, if you're switching from one place to the other, you know, I mean,
Right,
how do you know
exactly.
where it switches?
And better yet, scholarly opinion seems to suggest that many of these oracles were just but fragments of larger oracles. So kind of the same way that we look at Paul's letters. When Paul references things he wrote that we don't have preserved for us in the Bible, like a letter to the churches in Laodicea. Where's that at? All that to simply say there are parts of the Bible that were inspired to be a part of the fabric and others that are not. So if that's the case, is it possible that this little bitty oracle to Damascus was part of a much longer drawn out oracle against Damascus, but disciples, whoever was responsible for giving us this final rendition of this, took away from that under the guidance of the Holy Spirit to fit it in with this context as part of this 6 nation on one side layout, 6 nation on the other side, and a part of that spills into 17. But at the very end, this is the pivot point to say it spreads out to both ends of this spectrum of 6 and 6, that whoever comes against the Lord, doesn't matter when it is, the Lord rebukes them as the chaotic waters that they are, which takes us back to Genesis 1, does it not? Spirit of the Lord over the waters, rebuking them to draw the order of new creation out of that. It's kind of the same idea here. To speak to the coming judgment, but the fact that God is still sovereignly in control of it, and to give hope to the future generations of exiles that will look back to these words to know God is not doing them in to be done with them. that ultimately he will save them.